All right, and we're on.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar with MadKudu and Intercom. We're super excited to have you, super excited to talk today about scaling live chat and predictive lead scoring. I feel like maybe we should have turned on the cameras 30 minutes ago because, for instance, I just spent 30 minutes like talking and arguing about lead scoring and what the future of it is. So we'll try and bring some of that conversation into as well as we go through. A little bit of quick housekeeping. We have a bunch of slides to share, not too many, that we want to really get through and get a lot of insights to you, both about live chat, about our really exciting integration with MadKudu and the power of predictive lead scoring. But we are going to leave a bunch of time for questions. I anticipate that we'll have a lot of time for kind of live Q&A and discussion with you, the audience. We have like sort of a fairy godmother in the background, Maya, who as you guys send in questions, she'll be sharing them with me. So please feel free to do that at any time. If they come over, I may interrupt our chit chat to jump into your questions. So please do that. And if you stick around to the end, we may share a couple pieces of content and things that could be interesting for you as a follow-up to this event. Lastly, the slides will be available. Don't feel like you have to screenshot things or furiously take notes. The MadKudu team has graciously agreed to send these things out. And also this recording will be available at the very same link that you currently are accessing. Indefinitely. So don't feel like you need to memorize every word that we say. With that, I'd love to just jump into some quick introductions. Francis, do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to be here. So I'm Francis, the co-founder and CRO at MadKudu. My background initially was in data science, and I've kind of made it my goal to help companies with that skill and really, help companies grow without having to worry too much about how to apply data science to all of the data that's around them, and to share a bit of a story around that and to maybe share a bit of how much of a nerd I am. Actually, one of the opening episodes of The Big Bang Theory, the one about number 73, is actually a true story of mine that I shared with one of the writers of the show, and they've kind of made it a recurring joke in the show. So data science and like applying all this nerdiness to business has been a core part of my life. And the goal with MadKudu has really been to help a lot of these amazing companies like, Intercoms, IBMs, and Vision, to help the go-to-market teams really focus on what they do best and not worry about how to make really complex decisions with all the data that is coming to them. And so I'm excited today to really dive a little bit deeper and to share learnings about how that applies to chat in particular, and how to make it scale even better with more intelligence.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm going to have to go look up that episode. I'm very intrigued now. I'm going to check it out after we finish talking. For my part, I'm playing two roles today. I'm both your host and also I lead demand generation here at Intercom. Intercom, as I imagine many of you know, is a customer relationship platform. We help you grow faster through building better relationships with your prospects and customers. And today we're going to talk a lot about the chat portion of what we do and the messaging portion of what we do and how you compare that with the power of MadKudu to help your business grow faster. Quick personal introduction, I suppose, is this is kind of my third high-growth SaaS business I've worked in. And in all of them, lead scoring has both been one of my most powerful tools and one of my biggest headaches. So I'm really excited to talk with you all about some of the things we've learned and also chat with Francis about some of the things, hopefully some wisdom we can share with everyone on the meeting today. So I guess with that, why don't we jump in quickly? The agenda is we're going to talk a little bit about how live chat applied to sales can help you close deals faster and why that is. We'll talk a little bit about some good practices you can use. And then we'll jump really deep into sort of the predictive lead scoring side of things and how you can really make this practical for your company today if you just go ahead and install Intercom and the MadKudu app. So let's get going. So the first thing I just want to comment on, for those of you that sort of have embraced messaging and chat, you're probably already feeling this in your business. For those that haven't yet applied to their business, there's probably something that you yourself could kind of identify with, which is that people have changed the way they seek to talk to companies. And that's really a function of a huge change in the way they seek to talk to one another. If you just reflect on your own communications, like just right now for a minute, think about every message you've sent or every person you've talked to for the last 24 hours. What percentage of those were email? Probably a lot. What percentage of those were Slack messages or work IM or whatever? Probably a huge number. What percentage of those were WhatsApp, SMS, Facebook Messenger? Probably even more. And what percentage of those were a phone call? Basically zero. And that's really interesting because 20 years ago, that proportion would have been completely different. And we're in a moment in time here where that sort of behavioral change, where we choose and we prefer to talk through messaging over most other channels, is sort of kind of inundating the workplace. In fact, just point in case, Slack IPO just this morning, and their stock is up like crazy, built around this notion that there's a different, better way to communicate. Why would you make people fill out forms and pick up the phone to talk to you when there's a way that they obviously prefer? And we're going to talk a little bit now between Intercom and MadKudu on a way that can be obviously better for your company.
Right. And on that one, maybe one thing I wanted to share that I find always interesting is like this is part of kind of the journey becoming more and more digital, and forms to me always seem like the fax of today, right? Where if I booked a campground in the Grand Canyon and had to send a fax to them, and this seemed like such like a travel back in time, and I feel like forms are similar in that sense where you have to submit this thing, send it somewhere, and then you hope for something to happen. It's so different from how we're used to interacting with one another on a day-to-day basis, and it's just something of an old era. And I think people want this kind of synchronous element to that chat brings. And I think the other element is they also want to have control. They want to control when they engage and when they are engaged, and they don't want to just shoot something in the air and then wait for a response. And I think that's like something that we've seen a lot all over the place, and I think correlates to the success of chat recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And I think one thing that's really interesting here is we should emphasize it's not so much the idea of a form as isn't that little piece of JavaScript or that sits on your website that's the problem. It's exactly what Francis is talking about. It's this weird like a message in a bottle into the ocean type problem, and the ability of chat to sort of collapse the timeline from when you actually, I can jump for a slide and we can talk about this. I'll come back to that prior one, but to collapse the timeline from when you when your audience is seeking to talk to you to when they actually get to talk to you. And you as a business, the timeline from when you first encounter somebody who seems to want to buy, or at least has a question that could result in them wanting to buy, to when you actually get to sell to them. It's one of those rare things where everybody wins. They get answers faster, you get to sell faster, everyone's kind of happy. And that's kind of what this image is meant to kind of capture. The form itself, so be it. You could put a little, form box where people put information inside of a chat window as well. That's not so much the issue. It's the experiential aspect of this. It's the synchronicity that you get when you do all of this in a chat context that you lose when you do it in a website, form, email auto reply, follow up by sales, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where things start to really fall apart. And that represents a lot of the huge opportunity that you get when you sort of embrace chat. And I guess jumping back for a second, what that opportunity kind of looks like, we've done a lot of data crunching on our side, and that opportunity is really, really significant. What we've found is that 82% of website visitors who choose to chat will ultimately convert to customers, which is a pretty wild number when you think about it. Now, I fully acknowledge there's a little bit of a causation correlation thing inside of here that you have to kind of unpack, which is, are the people inclined to buy more inclined to chat? And I think that's a fair kind of point. But no matter how you slice it, I refuse to believe that this kind of a lift is solely caused by that. Cut it in half, and it still is suddenly your best lead channel. And so I think that there's a really important insight here about using this as a tool as quickly as possible to tap into the people's desire to communicate with your business in this way. And then lastly, on the other side, people who chat tend to buy more. And that, that's just a function of something that, as a marketer, that can be a bit challenging to acknowledge, but I think it's important to point out, which is sales works. Given the opportunity to sell to somebody, they will buy for more. And that's not just because of slimy salesmanship. It's because a seller can hear what somebody is seeking to buy and then craft an appropriate solution for them and explain the value of that solution properly. And that's the pattern that we see time and time again, is when people chat, you're essentially giving yourself more opportunity to have an unstructured conversation with your prospect, and as a consequence, cause them to buy more frequently, the stat on the left, and buy more, the stat on the right. And the combination of those two factors can have a really huge impact on your business performance. And I think it's something that, if there's one thing you take away from this, I think this is a really critical insight to take away. A couple other comments on sort of the ROI here. This is a super common statistic, but I think a very important one to understand. And it relates back to Francis's prior point. Chat is faster. And it just is faster because of the synchronous nature of it. And if you need a kind of an ROI stat to kind of capture some of the power of being faster, speed kind of wins. The famous truism in sales is time kills all deals. I think you can expand that to say time kills all leads. And in chat, it's so much less time to get to the sale, and you can be the vendor who answers the question first. Like I've watched our sales interactions. I kind of spy on our SDRs, and I've watched the interactions that they have and the records that come through, whether they chat or whether they email. And the SLA on how quickly they can interact with somebody and get a question answered it's so powerful to see things transition from an open-ended initial question to a high-intent buying question in a matter of minutes over chat. And the level of intent can only dissipate over 48 hours. The book or the meeting or the word of mouth moment that got them fired up to chat or fill out a form, if you can capitalize it immediately, you're going to make money. If you wait 2 days, they're going to get distracted and their boss is going to yell at them or whatever else is going to happen. And so the speed of chat is a critical factor here that you need to kind of be to account for. And then once you load predictive in there, then you can really start to optimize around that speed to ensure that you're applying your resources to the right places to get the highest ROI for your business. Last quick comment is live chat has really changed a lot. And I think when we use the word live chat, it conjures in a lot of people's minds. Excuse my language here, but like really horrible, crappy live chat that we all kind of got accustomed to in the earlier days of the internet. Like you click a button, a really horrible little thing shows up. It says, please wait 22 minutes for whoever from wherever to talk to you. And the thing to account for is live chat has become, in particular, I don't mean to brag, but with Intercom, in a really extensible, powerful environment, whereas marketers and sellers and operations people, we can build really customizable, interesting experiences. And for our prospects, we can really deliver a lot of value right in the chat in a way that feels slick and modern and matches their experience that they're having on WhatsApp or on Facebook Messenger, but in a business context. And this is really important to understand. Like you got to kind of break out of the mental model of like weird gray boxes with support reps and into a world where this is a selling channel and a customer experience channel, just like your website. You can build amazing, memorable things inside of here because of the extensible nature of live chat. So I'm gonna quickly just take a question, and Francis, I'd love for us to maybe go back and forth on this one a little bit. So one question from Ben is, what's an actual pitfall around lead scoring, especially applied to live chat? I have some ideas, but maybe Francis, would you mind sharing just a mistake that you see people make all the time when it comes to lead scoring in live chat?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple. I think one of them is to rely solely on where the lead is coming from. Essentially, I mean, it's hard to have more data and to try to push that directly to all the reps. I think if you try to expose all of your chats to reps in the hope that because 82% of these chats are like will convert to customers, like you have that hope, and so you start pushing all your reps to the live chat, it's very time consuming for them and they have to pay attention to the chat all the time. Unfortunately, there's a lot of like initial chats that are not necessarily qualified, so they can lose a lot of trust, and it's very damaging for the relationship between the rep and the concept of live chat. And yeah, you only have one first impression. It's generally very hard to get the reps back into the idea of adopting live chat. So like I think the pitfall is to try and do like a full blown release to all of your reps at once without like testing the waters and figuring out where you want to throttle and what you want to throttle to make sure that you have a successful launch, and that the reps actually see the value from it, and that they don't just remember only talking to like a couple of leads in India and 2 students.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a great point, and I think just to expand on it, and like in live chat, but also outside of it, I think the principle here actually exists outside of live chat, which is that you only get so many at bats, to use sort of the baseball metaphor, with your sales team, where they're going to kind of take a leap of faith with you, and you have to use those very sparingly. And so whether it's launching live chat specifically or lead scoring in general, or whatever the case may be, a really dangerous practice that can really set you back quite a bit is if the initial waves of leads aren't tuned correctly for a new channel. And live chat in particular, because even as much as you use bots and automation, and we'll talk about a bit about that a little later in today's conversation, even as much as you use it to try and like triage and avoid the worst, if that first wave of live chat sale just burns hours of your sales team's time to no good effect, they're going to start, your service levels will drop. They will look into the live chat channel more slowly. They will spend less time on it. They will care less. And then it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy where the first leads were bad, therefore they worked them badly, therefore the next leads were bad, therefore they worked them badly, and before you know it, you're shutting down the channel. And that's a really common kind of tailspin that people can get into. And so I think kind of the implication of what Francis and I are saying is you do need to move aggressively to embrace this channel. Like I know I sell this product, so you may want to take it with a grain of salt, but like I have only seen good things happen with companies that take this channel seriously. But if you go too quickly, you can really create some scar tissue that will take a long time to kind of work out of the system. And you want to kind of be thoughtful about your sales partnership as you do it.
Right. And I think on the flip side, I think like the part that's really important in what you mentioned is to take the channel seriously and to understand that it is as complex as your other channels, and not think that it's just a matter of dropping a bot on your landing pages and you're going to see your conversion rate just go through the roof immediately. It's really important to understand that the messaging that you're going to use, how you're going to build the different bots that you're going to have, like the questions that you're asking have to be part of a relevant journey. Like you don't want this to be like, you know, imagine like a terrible form where you're basically asking people like 15 questions before they can get anything, even though like ideally you should make it as frictionless as possible for them to get the information they're coming in for. So I think like on the flip side of saying like either having all your reps manning the chat and have no automation, and that can be really dangerous because you're going to like drive your sales team away. On the flip side, if you have only automation and a super cumbersome process, you're going to drive your customers away. So I think as Brian was saying, it's really taking this very, very seriously and testing a lot and iterating and really trying to use as much empathy as possible to understand how is the chat making the experience of the visitor better and how is it bringing value to their experience. Like it's not about repeating what's on the page. It's not just about asking a question like, hey, do you want to schedule a demo? Do you want to schedule a demo? It's about really trying to figure out what is the right question at the right time to ask to make it frictionless, like essentially scaling what a good rep would do with a good lead.
That's great. So I'm going to start jumping into good practices here, but one thing I'm noticing is we're getting a lot of questions. Please keep them coming. These are awesome questions. I'm excited to engage them. They're a little bit more sophisticated than some of the practices on this slide. I think these are like the things I'm going to share are like important core concepts, but I'm going to work through them a little quickly so that we can touch on some of these more sophisticated ideas. And caveat in advance, if Francis or I say something dumb, we didn't know these questions beforehand, so cut us a little slack. So, okay, first thing, this is fairly straightforward, but again, to kind of Francis's point, like you need to step into this with the end in mind and with an understanding of the capacity you have to play with and how you're going to get there. So before you begin, like, don't roll your eyes. This is important. You need to define your goals for this channel. And you can do this with a simple little Excel spreadsheet model, like what percentage of your leads do you think will chat? Okay, based on what pages and so on. If they chat, what will happen? And kind of build from there so that you have some objective standard on whether this is working or not. And understand that you're going to be testing, so you may end up revising your goals, like in some cases really quickly as you learn. But nonetheless, start with the business outcome you're trying to get to, and then work backwards through to the experience you're going to be crafting in the messenger. And then on the flip side, balancing the question of automation and human capacity, there will be a need for human capacity. Don't let all of the bot hoopla convince you otherwise. No bot is good enough to account for every permutation of an interaction with a human being. And if you try to build the super complex rule set that does that, the experience for your end user is going to be so horrible that you've essentially ruined your channel before you even started. So don't forget about the people involved. It's just a classic error that almost everyone, when they first start playing with a new channel and automating that channel, kind of make. So that's just some basics for how you get started. One of the things that we really find is very powerful in terms of sort of ensuring that you get enough transactional volume into the channel is you kind of have to prompt people to talk to you. Not necessarily, if possible, in an annoying way, like 1 second after they enter the page that you're interrupting them, like you may want to give them a little time. And one of the really interesting variables to experiment with is how long to give them before you sort of have the interruptive thing pop up. But if all you have is the little intercom circle in the bottom right corner, there's going to be a significant percentage of your audience that is not familiar with that as a channel for interaction and doesn't know that they can get questions answered and can improve their experience of browsing your products really quickly through that channel. So to have the messenger be completely passive is generally a mistake, but you also want to think critically about how to make it proactive. And one of the great practices we find is to both test when should it come up, like what page, we'll get to the pages in a second, how quickly should it come up, and what should you ask to prompt the conversation. We have one customer I love talking to because he experiments constantly with which animated GIF to use. And he's through testing landed on some really interesting like GIFs that make him lots of money, which is a really weird sentence to say. I never thought I would be saying. But as a result, like he knows the GIF that will cause him to make more money versus not. And as silly as that sounds, if your business is the kind that can sustain that, I would recommend that kind of experimentation. If not GIFs, Intercom has a video capability where you can make your own videos and animated GIFs of your own so that you can kind of come up with your own thing and so that you're not showing like Grumpy Cat or something if that doesn't work for your brand. The next thing is people, and that goes to that video point I was talking about, is like being human, whether it's through a GIF, whether it's through showing the face of your people, whether it's through having specific names of your people. People outperform just very generic information, and people reply and respond really well to when you kind of talk to them almost like you're speaking to them casually in real life or over a messaging product like a WhatsApp or whatever the case may be. Now, obviously, that's not appropriate for every brand. If you're a bank, I'm not advocating for like Grumpy Cat GIFs every 2 seconds, but having a person, letting that person speak as though they were speaking face to face in a branch is going to be a whole lot better than a bunch of canned auto replies and macros that were approved and run through 17 different layers of lawyers. And one thing that's a good practice is like, if you think about sort of the tonality that most companies sort of use in social media, you can use a similar, whatever your business is comfortable with in social media, you can use that same tonality in chat. So that's kind of how I would think about it there. Next thing is you kind of want to be transparent with bots. Bots should be used. You need to have them in your workflow because, to Francis's point, a lot of these conversations are not going to be sales ready, and you need the ability to deflect things that you don't want your most expensive internal resources dealing with. And on the other hand, a lot of questions are super routine and could be resolved just with a bot. What are your opening hours? Well, there's no reason for a human being to process that. Just let the bot answer it. What day of the month do we get invoices? You know, whatever the case may be. The really obvious stuff, it's appropriate to send over to bots, but you want to be clear that it is one. If you misrepresent that a bot is a person, what often happens is when you hit the end of the decision tree that the bot can handle, you end up with this really uncomfortable moment where the person feels sort of like betrayed about the lack of transparency, and you see a lot of drop off and a lot of frustration. So it's not that you shouldn't use them, it's that you should just be explicit that you are using them and very aware of their limitations. I mentioned this, I alluded to this before, but you know, you don't, because of capacity and things like that, you don't necessarily want to fire a proactive message everywhere on your website. And so you really need to be aware of context and intent and adapt your messages accordingly. On low intent, higher in the funnel pages with a typical user, maybe it's your blog, or maybe it's a white paper that you have. You probably want to have a very different form of message and timing for when the messenger fires than on your pricing page. Where presumably it's a much higher intent audience and they probably have much more specific questions that if you had the opportunity to answer them, you might be able to pull these people down the funnel to revenue faster. And so you really want to think hard. One useful thing to do is just look at your sitemap and start categorizing pages as best as you can by the level of intent that sort of it kind of implies for a user to be there. And that's like a gross misrepresentation, of course. You're just kind of picking big buckets and doing your best. But you start there and that lets you think about how aggressively to intervene and what kind of messaging you should use to intervene, and what offers to make. You don't want to offer a demo in a context where people are just getting familiar with what you do. On the other hand, it could be the absolute best thing to do to intervene and offer a demo when somebody is about to drop off the page from your pricing page or something like that. Another just valuable basic is to set expectations. If you tell somebody you're going to answer them in a minute, you damn well better answer them in a minute. If you tell them it's going to be a couple hours, you damn well better do it in a couple hours. If you tell them it's going to be a couple days, I would suggest you improve your service level agreement. Otherwise, what are you doing in chat? And I think the bots can be really valuable here. If you can't get down to that minutes or hours level of reply, you definitely want to let the bot do it for them, because at least then there's some payoff for the person having engaged with your messenger. It can be the bot saying, here's a potential answer to your question or multiple potential answers to your question. Not satisfied? Give us your phone number, give us your email, we'll get back to you as soon as we possibly can. And at least there's like some resolution. There's nothing worse than dropping a question and just an infinite silence. That's no better than the challenges we started with around forward behavior. So really think hard about this, and how do you set expectations, and where do you use a bot? If you can't meet a certain set of expectations, how do you use a bot to mitigate the downside of that? Okay, I'll pause there. If anyone has questions about anything we just said, feel free to ask. I'm going to take a second. I'm going to jump into a couple of the questions folks are asking, and then we're going to start dipping into predictive lead scoring, which I'm really excited to talk about. All right, as I look to my left here, here's an interesting question. All right, what about live chat for high value B2C type interactions? So I hear this a lot because B2B has this very standard kind of like demo request sales process that we've all sort of adopted, but B2C is a bit different. And in particular, high value B2C, like whatever, jewelry or cars or expensive audio equipment or whatever, has a different behavior. And I'm curious, Francis, what have you seen about companies using predictive scoring and chat and stuff in B2C? And if you don't know, I can comment as well.
I mean, I've seen a few. One of the things that's been interesting is actually on a lot of the high value B2C. I would say maybe not. I know in the question was mentioned things like automotive. I think in high value, which was more like investment funds and things like that, where like there's a high value of the transaction and there's a high level of service. You actually tend to see similar sales motions as what we would see in B2B, where there is a demo request, there is a get in touch. I think on the automotive side, I mean, there's like one company comes to mind that does this more asynchronously than a chat, which would be something like Conversica, where they like will kind of mimic an SDR and like do all the follow-ups for any kind of request that's there, which I think is like one step towards in that direction. So there's definitely a lot of potential, and people do it to try and run that qualification. I think there's a high value in having the chat in there because again, like you can use the chat to do some level of identification of who's someone you want to route to a person versus who's someone you want to route to some more, nurturing material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would agree. I think that there's definitely a common misconception that this stuff is only for B2B. And like the example I always like to think of, there's many, but like there's just an Intercom customer that I love who sells farm equipment, I think in like Nebraska. And it's just like a wild thing to me. The guy sells tractors, and he is such a huge advocate for Intercom because he sells so many tractors with chat, which like, again, is a sentence I never thought I would say. And I think that the specific kind of thing that we're sort of talking about here is that there are a lot of high consideration purchases that have similar patterns to B2B. And even though you may not necessarily have a big SDR team or whatever, anything that's like a pretty high consideration purchase and honestly, even just like a couple $100s for sneakers is a pretty high consideration purchase. People don't do that lightly. There's a lot of opportunity for a product like Intercom, chat in general, to again help kind of short circuit the sales process. And you do need to apply it a little differently because the workflow is different. And so I think this is an area where not all B2C companies do this because they think often very much in the context of databases and engaged users and reselling to people who have bought in the past. But really sort of whiteboarding out and drawing out your sales process as best as you can understand it is something that it comes very natural to B2B companies and isn't always something that e-commerce companies do. And so doing that and then thinking about, again, sort of where does the intent manifest? How do I intervene through chat to accelerate that? And more you're seeing this in like relatively high consideration and very high consideration B2C. We see it with sneakers, we see it with tractors, we see it with cars, we see it with expensive electronics, we see it with subscription products B2C. So like boxes, all those box products, educational products. You see a lot of that because it's just something that very few people buy on impulse. And anything that is people are not inclined to buy on impulse, chat with the appropriate lead scoring automation can probably really help. One question that's coming up a lot, and I normally would address it at the end, but it's just so much here, I'll just jump into it, is sort of thinking about marketing automation tools that aren't chat. And I know, Francis, you have a lot of opinions about this, is just like, does chat work well if you're trying to match it up with Pardot or with HubSpot? And like, what are some good ways to kind of like stitch all this stuff together? And I imagine you have a couple thoughts on that, and I have a few as well. If you'd be up for sharing, Francis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on our multiple ways, like without like pitching too much MadKudu, that's one of the things that we do is actually like take all that data in, because like some of these automation platforms will have a direct connection with Intercom, so you're able to essentially have that information in there automatically. But for those who don't, like typically what we do is we're ingesting all of this data and we're essentially identifying who's an account, who's a target account, who's a customer, what tier, all of that, so that whenever there's a new lead that comes in, whenever we ping our API, we're able to get a sense of where is this person and where is this account in terms of their customer journey with you, so that you're able to identify where they're at, and like have a messaging that's relevant if they're a customer versus if they're a target account versus if they're a prospect, which I think is like one of the elements that Intercom is starting to talk a little bit more about on the ABM side of saying, when you have target accounts, how do you actually have an experience with the chat that matches even better that kind of ABM flow of saying you want a flow that's relevant to to that lead, because they belong to an account that already is assigned to someone that's been touched by someone, and we know where they're at in their buying journey.
Cool. I guess, yeah, the one thing I will add, and obviously I'm seeing these questions, so I have a little more context perhaps than you do in some of these, for instance, is I think some of the folks are also wondering, how does the lead score intelligence that comes out of MadKudu, how does that get spread out across all the different various systems? Like, does it work well with making governing decisions that Pardot might make? Does it work well with governing decisions that Marketo or HubSpot might make? And how is that typically set up?
Got it. Yeah. So that makes sense. So essentially, so one of the challenges was like and we were talking about this before we went live, but one of the challenges was, let's say, a lead score that you build in Marketo or in Pardot, is that it leverages data that is in that platform, and the score sits in that platform. So then you can propagate it to Salesforce, and then from Salesforce you can propagate it to Intercom, or Marketo directly to Intercom, I believe. The challenge there is that you're potentially missing data. So if you have an analytics database or system, if you're tracking everything in Mixpanel or something like that, that data is very rich, and you're not necessarily able to capture it for the lead score. And the other thing, point-based lead scores in those marketing automation platforms take some time to compute, and they have no concept of an account, right? So where MadKudu is slightly different is that we ingest all of this data and build the score both at the lead and the account level, so that if you have a new lead from an account that is already engaged, that lead is actually going to inherit in part the engagement score of the account, to say, hey, this is a new lead, we've never seen him, but actually their score should not be 0, because this is a lead that's part of a very engaged account, and therefore their score should be very high, because we want a rep to talk to them quickly, because they're potentially let's say, the buyer or the champion for this account that we want to close. And I think that's where there's a big change in possibilities of instrumentation that comes from what seems like a minor change in technicality. It's like this ability to compute scores at the account level, to even have the concept of accounts, which is not native in the scorings of Marketo and Pardot or even HubSpot, and being able to then propagate those scores across the different platforms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree. I think that's one of the most powerful things. Like, we're slowly, and I want to talk about B2C in a moment, but I'll just comment on B2B first. Like, B2B is slowly, and actually almost weirdly slowly, because the notion of account has always governed what salespeople do, basically, like in B2B. And then it kind of turned to this ABM thing, which allowed it to start to govern what marketers do. But we're still, it feels a lot of cases like we're starting to trying to retrofit software that doesn't understand account for a world with accounts. And that's just naturally how software works. But I think something like MadKudu, which has that notion and can pretty seamlessly put smart things about accounts in all the systems you already have, is one of those really powerful ways to kind of leapfrog forward for a B2B business. It's like, instead of sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, how do I make Marketo understand accounts, and doing all kinds of crazy things, you could buy something like MadKudu and probably fast forward a little bit that process and start to get that benefit propagated into your Salesforce instance, into your Intercom instance, and so on quite quickly. One thing that people asked, and for instance, genuinely, I don't know the answer. Maybe the answer is you guys haven't built this yet, but can MadKudu be applied in a B2C context where account is a little bit less relevant and Clearbit doesn't necessarily return data, or ZoomInfo or whatever doesn't necessarily return data as easily? Can MadKudu add value in that situation?
It can be. It's not something we're focusing on for, I guess, 2 reasons. Like you mentioned, like Clearbit, which essentially is like one of our third-party providers for data enrichment on the lead and the account level. The challenge in B2C is that the typical enrichment providers in B2B don't work in B2C. There's some really good ones in B2C, like Tower Data, Experian, all of that. But so we haven't built native connectors with those. However, the whole concept of learning from historical data to build, to predict what's going to happen in the future off of first-party data absolutely works in B2C the same way that it works in B2B. I would argue that it's actually a little bit simpler, because there's not this hierarchical concept of leads that show behavior that roll up to an account, and you might have two people within an account that are showing a lower level of behavior, but the fact that there are two actually means that the account is engaged. So it's even easier on the B2C side because you're really looking at the activity of one user, and then you want to score them based on the information that you have. But yeah, like there's a ton of stuff that you can do even just based on IP lookups, of looking at what the zip code the person is in, what browser they're using. There's a ton of predictions you can make around the lifetime value of a customer just based on those elements that are fairly easy to obtain.
Cool. So okay, I think in short the answer is not the concepts all work. The tech could work,
Right.
but it's maybe a roadmap down the road type thing that MadKudu might get to eventually.
Correct.
Cool. And I guess for those of you out there that are thinking about that, I think I would definitely anchor on the point Francis made initially, which is there's probably some stuff you could do today to start chipping away at this problem, and then you can just buy MadKudu in like 12 months when they're ready for you to buy it. And then I guess one last question, then we'll jump back into slides just because it's super easy. Going out to Pedro here is, can you connect Intercom to Salesforce and Pardot? And the answer is yes, out of the box with Salesforce. Pardot, no, but you can use Salesforce kind of as your Switzerland, your bridge to get the data, or you could use a third-party tool or API to get the data into Pardot, which is, if you have a little bit of engineering time, is not a big ask. It's people do it routinely, and it's not a lot of work. But out of the box, you could get the information to Pardot just by way of sending it through Salesforce, which is what most people end up doing, and it's really easy to do. Okay, please keep your questions coming. I'm going to let Francis talk a little bit about predictive, and then we'll jump back into questions in a few minutes. So Francis, just let me know when you're ready, and I'll start going through the slides for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And now I need to do better than calling Salesforce Switzerland, the Switzerland of the tech stack. Love it. Cool. So yeah, maybe like on the next slide, like the idea is to talk a bit about lead scoring and how it applies to chat, and just maybe making sure that we're all grounded here, but it seems based on the level of the questions that we can go fairly quickly through this. But yeah, the whole concept of lead scoring, why do we do it? Really, the idea is to build a ranking mechanism to isolate your priority leads and to be able to essentially differentiate and tier the level of interaction you're going to have with different types of leads. And really that's the goal of lead scoring, just being able to separate and rank your leads so that you can bucket them into tiers and you can apply different go-to-market strategies against them. And so generally this is a very mature concept on the B2B side, and maybe in terms of the data that's used to do a lot of the scoring. On the next slide, we're essentially pretty much everyone knows this again, but there's firmographic level, which is company information, like with the typical stuff of where are they based, how big are they, who's the person, and what actions they've taken. And essentially, a lot of this is interesting because it always falls back into some of the, I guess, like standard sales frameworks with, to double down on what Brian was saying, like sales works. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from sales and not necessarily like always point the finger at them. But like when you think of BANT and all of the different elements, right? There's like budget, authority, need, and timing. And I think, budget is definitely something that's typically going to be at a high level, like company related. Like if you're selling $100,000 software, it's going to be harder to sell to a company that is not making any revenue. So like the budget is typically something that at a first level ties to the company. The authority is going to be something that is tied to the person. So that's really where the job title and all those elements come into play. The need is something that is, I would say, like at a high level again, from the company, like does the company have a need for this product? So if you're a software company, you probably don't have a need for a tractor. And then there's a second component, which is the person, where, even though the company might have a need for, let's say, a chat solution, then if you're the the head of engineering, maybe you're not the person who needs a chat, but if the person talking to you is the head of the man gen, then there's actually a stronger need. And from a timing standpoint, that's where a lot of the behavioral elements come into play to measure that intent. And so, yeah, a lot of these are concepts that are fairly standard. And so the idea is really to be able to take all of this data, sift through it to identify what are some patterns and be able to allocate scores to it in order to, again, rank your different leads across this to figure out which are the ones that you want to target with, more down funnel or up funnel kind of messaging. And so one of the challenges here, and one of the reasons why people actually do use predictive analytics, On the next slide, we'll describe quickly what that means. But the idea behind the need for predictive analytics is that there's a lot of data. There's a lot of missing data, especially in B2B, and there's a lot of preconceived ideas. I think, and that's where predictive really helps, is going beyond preconceptions and really, kind of breaking this like Glenn Ross kind of idea that like marketing is saying you can't close the leads we give you, and sales is saying like the leads are garbage. And really being able to look at, well, is there a change actually in the lead quality? If we look at historical success, like are we aligned with what we've seen in the past? And so that's one thing of like having kind of this dispassionate conversion conversation, of looking at what is the conversion we can expect from the leads that we're getting based on what we've seen historically. And I think almost more importantly, there's a big element around preconceived ideas. I mean, we were talking about how the journey has moved to digital in the past few years. I think another big thing that has changed over the last maybe like 10, 20 years is that we live in a world that is more and more polarized, and people have very strong opinions, and they want to form those opinions very quickly. And I'd recommend anyone to watch this amazing TED Talk by Hans Rosling, and we'll share the link to it. But essentially, one of the things he shows is that his master's students in geoeconomics knew statistically significantly less than chimpanzees about some geoeconomic topic. And the whole point is that it's not that they're stupid, it's just that they have these preconceived notions of like what country is in a better place than another country. And so when they're asked to, pick between one and the other, they actually pick the wrong ones because of their preconceived ideas, whereas a chimpanzee would just randomly pick one or the other. And that's where data analysis and leveraging your historical data for like some form of predictive is really helpful to make sure you can overcome those preconceived ideas. So next slide, please. I guess just diving a little bit into what that looks like, I guess, to some extent, is saying essentially moving from this idea of saying we're going to build like the lead scores that we were talking about from Pardot and Marketo. We're saying, well, someone signs up, we're going to give them points. Someone starts a chat, we're going to give them points. Someone has this title, we're going to give them points. Someone is like from this big of a company, we give them points, and go into something a little more complex and a little more nuanced that understands that there's covariance between elements, and that a company that is 3,000 employees large could be a university. And so now you need to add another rule in there. Say, well, actually, it's like a big company, but it's not a university. And actually, it's not a company that belongs to an industry that requires HIPAA compliance to work with them, because we're not HIPAA compliant. And then it's not this, and it's not that. And essentially, like building those decision trees is extremely cumbersome and complicated, and it's almost impossible to maintain. And it takes a very long time to run the scoring, right? Because you have to run everything through your automation platform to run all of these scores, and it lives in there, and it's hard to distribute across the board. And that's why, like at MadKudu, we actually provide this as an API service, so that when you give an email, it's actually going to look at historical conversion rates for leads that were similar to this one, to then give you that output, so that you have that response available in real time all across your stack. And maybe in terms of what it looks like, as I mentioned, right, it's really about ingesting all the data, and that's one of the complexities of it, is ingesting all your in-app data. If you're a SaaS platform, ingesting all the marketing activity data, ingesting all the CRM information, as we talked about, like who's a target account, who's a customer, enriching all of that with third-party information, so technographic and firmographic, and then from that being able to run this like machine to understand what is your ideal customer profile statistically, what is a somewhat ideal but like not perfect profile, and what are the conversion rates associated with it, so that you can have a proper conversation with marketing around when to trigger a chat, or when to trigger some kind of like MQL flow. Cool. And maybe the last element is I just deep dive a little bit into this one, because when you're doing a lot of the scores in the marketing automation platforms, one of the challenges there is you're basically building one score that combines the behavioral element and the firmographic elements. And the challenge of that is if you try to apply this to your chat, where potentially there's no prior behavior, your score is very, very incomplete, because you're no longer trying to score your database within the concept of everyone using your website. You're actually trying to score someone within the concept of a net new lead that came in through your chat. And like the only thing that matters in most of the cases is going to be the firmographic score. So that's why like being able to build the scores independently and then like together is critical, so that you can isolate one type of score for a specific context. So in the case of live chat, you want to be able to say, if this is a brand new visitor that just input their email, like at this point, and brand new meaning that there's no account that ties back to it, we want to say, well, the only qualification that we're going to use to determine what should happen next is going to be based on their firmographic information, and considering that the chat is like high intent enough. And so I think like, yeah, building like having those three scores separately is actually critical in being able to run smarter instrumentations, and not to have to add a bunch of rules all over the place. Say, well, yeah, if it's a live chat or if it's a demo request, then we actually don't want to look at the rest of the behavior. We just want to look at the firmographic scores.
And I'll just interject quickly here, just across these choices of how to represent the scores. I would highly advise folks not to expose the numeric scores to your sales team or to your business partners that are not in the operations group that are implementing this. All it will do is create lots of questions about why is this a 36 versus a 41, and like generally that's not like an interesting or meaningful conversation to have. If you orient around the segment definitions, or even better, in my experience, is the emoji version of this, where you use colors and symbols, you will get a much higher level of uptake from your business partners, and avoid a lot of frankly fruitless conversations that you won't get a lot of value out of. So please learn from my mistakes, and don't use the score, expose it all over the place.
Right. And the other element that I think was critical here is also the signals, right? Like being able to explain to your business partners why you've allocated a score or another is actually something that helps a lot in driving the conversation, so that they don't just look at the email and say, hey, I don't agree with this score.
Okay.
So anyway, yeah, the goal is to minimize the amount of leads that your team should be working to have the same kind of impact. And the idea behind that is not that you want to minimize the team, is that you want to help the team put actually a lot more effort on a subset of the leads. So it's really about really white glove experience for the best kind of leads. And so really maybe going quickly over the three main use cases, because I know we're running out of time and there's a couple more questions that looked really interesting that we might want to cover. But kind of using predictive in the chat. I think the first use case is really being able to run that segmentation, so understanding who's who should be treated as a VIP when they come in, who's a lead from a hot account, and how are you going to deal with them, who's a lead from a target account, and being able to run a more ABM play with them. And ultimately, the idea behind that is, if you think of it in very simple terms, if IBM comes and knocks at your door versus my crazy uncle, you probably want to have a very different experience, both for the user, but also for your go-to-market team. And this is a first decision point of saying, well, now, okay, we have the crazy uncle, we have the IBM, what experience do we want to have for both? And being able to start thinking about it that way and building your flow in that sense. So that helps you to customize at a much broader scale, because you can customize without needing to have necessarily one-to-one conversations. And maybe going a little bit deeper into that use case, there's the idea of being able to qualify people in real time. So you're saying if someone inputs their email, again, take the example of IBM. IBM is on your pricing page, and they start, they input their email and say, hey, I'm from IBM, blah, blah, blah. Ideally, you would want to give them access to a rep's calendar and say, okay, we can complex questions, given that you're an enterprise customer, there's going to be a ton of questions what are the security elements here? How do you do admin portals, blah, blah, blah. And that's where having a person interact with them is going to be much more helpful than trying to do it with a bot. And so being able to run that qualification in real time to then have the bot trigger another application like a Calendly calendar is super helpful. And we've seen massive uptakes in bookings for pipeline generated from the chats directly. And the final one, which again is a a variance of this use case is really like maybe more granular in terms of routing your leads based on reps and based on the score. So being able to say, if you have a high quality lead, you want to push them to a rep and ideally to a calendar, or at least like show the rep why you want them to interact with this lead, which is what we have in the app in the inbox. If it's a medium quality lead, then potentially like have a bot run some more qualification to get more information to refine the score. And then if it's a low quality lead, then potentially push them to more nurture content or some form of a grouped webinar.
Great.
So I know we kind of had to go quickly through these, but we'll send like the recording, we'll have all of it, and we'll be more than happy to take questions even offline after this. But yeah, Brian, I think there was a bunch of additional questions that seemed relevant. So yeah, happy to
absolutely. I think we should jump into those. All I will add is I think that those use cases that Francis just shared. All I want to emphasize is how easy they are to embrace. Like nothing about what Francis just demonstrated takes like a month or 8 weeks to figure out. Once you have MadKudu set up and Intercom set up, like you get to a point where you are automatically qualifying and booking meetings. Is very, very straightforward. And I just want to emphasize that because sometimes you can kind of file away these things like, oh, we'll get to it. And this is one of those ones where like, if you get to it sooner, you'll get the benefit sooner. And it's not going to eat 4 weeks out of your team or your own effort. It's going to eat a couple days. Obviously, you have to configure all the tools to begin with, but if you've got the foundation, it's very straightforward to get to a world where people are visiting your site and meetings are just happening. And that's a really exciting place to be to help your company grow. All right. We have what looks like about 8 minutes left. We'll try and get everyone out on time. So I guess first question to jump into, I think this is a pretty straightforward one from Ashkan. Thank you for asking. Francis, is MadKudu only useful for B2B SaaS? Or can you use it for more classic enterprise B2B businesses? Like, do you have to be some high-flying SaaS business like Intercom or Envision or something to get benefit?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the answer is no. This works for any B2B companies. Yeah, we talked a little bit about SaaS because that's generally where there's an even higher level of complexity with like a higher volume of data. But the challenges are fairly similar in your classic enterprise sales motion of, again, like understanding which accounts are engaged, and there's going to be potentially a lower level of engagements where you don't have people like browsing your app and things like that, which actually makes a tool like MadKudu even more relevant because it's much harder to mine the right signals to understand which accounts are hot and ready for engagement.
I totally agree. I would say like one of the powers of like a freemium SaaS model is like the most high intent thing somebody can do is to start a trial, and that's a pretty obvious thing. You don't need predictive lead scoring to say maybe somebody should talk to that person. Whereas if you're in a different business model, like you need to hunt harder to find those high value signals, and that's not an easy thing to do. And I think that MadKudu can really add a lot of value for non-SaaS businesses in a way that we can kind of take a little bit for granted in SaaS. Actually, I think this is another great one for you, Francis. Sorry to put you on the spot, but given that you've, I think, done a lot of work over in Europe, I would love to ask, like, for data enrichment, is there anything else out there that can help with European data? Things that are GDPR compliant, not too scary, that folks might want to go check out? And that's a question from Ben.
Yeah, there's a couple. So there's one in particular data provider. I mean, mainly B2B. I'm sorry, I have very little knowledge on B2C for Europe, but on the B2B side, there's Cognizant, which like their big claim, I think like all over their website says we are the only like GDPR compliant data enrichment platform and specialized in EMEA data. That's one. The second one that is not person level enrichment, but company level is so from Bureau Van Dyke. So they have a product called Orbis, and they do like private company data enrichment. So in terms of like revenue, company size, things like that. And they work really well in that sense. And because it's company level, it is GDPR compliant because there's no PII data in there. And they basically obtain that information from, I think, scraping a lot of things out there. And then like on the technographic side, I mean, like most of the tools work fairly well, but I would encourage like building like a JavaScript scraper yourself if like one specific technographic is going to be the thing that that is the most important in the
Great.
scoring.
And I just jotted down both of those names because I've been hunting for some good European data sources lately. That's one thing I would just advise everybody. Data is not a place to be cheap. There's a lot of places where you can cut corners and save yourself a little bit of money. And I would say I would rather reduce my ad budget a bit and know I have awesome data for the leads I do get versus the other way. So that's just a bit of just general advice, but something I would emphasize. Data is not a place to cut corners. I guess a question I'll take from Chris, thank you very much, Chris, is should you have separate bots for FAQs and troubleshooting for sales, or should you combine the FAQ and troubleshooting bots with your sales bots? I think the intent of that question is getting at, like, because so much of your traffic is going to be customers with support questions or non-qualified spam stuff, and then some of it's really for sales, how should those bots relate to one another? It's a great question. Usually what I would recommend is that you have a bot that does the initial triage to try and shove people into a correct bucket of support or sales. And you can do that really easily, which is asking people, are you a customer or not? And then once you know if they're a customer or not, you can have like secondary bots that go into like your deeper trees. And that's what I would recommend. So essentially, it's basically, I guess, like one Uber bot, but you want to have separate branches based on whether you're sending people into an FAQ type scenario or a customer support type scenario or a sales qualification type scenario. And if you happen to be an Intercom customer and you bought our articles product and our answer bot product, you can start to do really cool stuff with surfacing articles automatically inside of those conversations. And it lets you address and resolve questions super duper fast. We have a bunch of data from customers that do that, and they're saving like literally like people weeks by implementing that thing. And when you think about the cost of that, like weeks and weeks of human effort, it's a really meaningful benefit to your business, and it lets you do better arbitrage of your people's time. It lets them sell more and answer questions less. Or in the case of support, answer hard questions more instead of silly questions more. So that's kind of how I would approach that problem. I guess we'll hit one last question, and then we'll actually, you know what? I'm going to pause. If we jump into a question, we're going to keep everybody too long. So we'll get to these a little after. Feel free to send a message into the Intercom Messenger or MadKudu, or find us on Twitter or on LinkedIn, and we'll answer your questions further. I want to say thank you again to everybody for joining us. Really, really grateful for all your questions, your participation. Thank you so much, Francis, for sharing all your wisdom and hard-won knowledge about how to do this well, and for building a great product in MadKudu. And yeah, slides start to come by email. Expect some follow-up, and this recording will be available very, very soon. So please feel free to watch it, follow up, ask questions. We're here to help you be successful.
Yeah, thanks a ton, Brian, for this. This was great, and thanks for sharing a lot of insights. Also, yeah, the one thing I will say, feel free to keep on adding questions in here. So the live recording will actually be hosted on directly on a similar page to this, where you can keep on adding questions and interacting with the chat. And so most likely we'll come and we'll answer some of the questions in here, and we'll send the notes along with the email that will have the link to the slides and all of that. But thanks a ton for all joining, and yeah, thanks, Brian, for running this.
Thank you all. Awesome. Have a wonderful day, and good luck with your live chat.
All right.